Well, we are gradually approaching the end of day one of the conference with a triplet of very interesting topics. Monstrous seals, locusts, and relics that are transported by sea. So, we'll start. So, Monstrous Seals by Ryan Denson.
Thank you very much. So this is something that's a bit of an offshoot of a larger project. I did my PhD thesis on sea monsters in the Greco-Roman world, and so this is something part of a larger project on seals that I'm doing, and which is itself part of another larger project to consider. I mean, a lot of imaginary animals are plainly created from different parts of real animals, but what happens when we look at the effects of imaginary animals onto real animals in terms of cultural history, in terms of how imaginary animals affect perceptions of real animals? And so that's what this is, a little bit of a snippet from using some of the classical Greco-Roman sources to explain this tale of Thecla that becomes very, very popular in the Byzantine world. So yes, so seals are known in the modern world as being essentially among the most playful of marine animals. They're called Seehunds in German, and people tend to favorably compare them to the sorts of positive qualities that you see in your own pet dogs, in the sense that seals, we associate them, again, with a sort of playful, friendly nature, particularly towards humans. But this is really something that's a characteristic of our modern culture's perspective on seals. And such an extremely positive characterization of them was not a universal thing. So this was certainly not the case in the ancient Greco-Roman and Byzantine cultural views of them, which considered them instead as monstrously liminal creatures, albeit ones whose hides could sometimes benefit humans. And it's through exploring how these animals were conceptualized that we can also get a better glimpse at these cultural views of nature, in which we can see with the Byzantine reception of a story about a female martyr, Thecla, and her encounter with seals. So I should first introduce that story itself, which is from originally a 2nd century Greek hagiography, where this Christian woman, Thecla, has been sentenced to death for her faith. And so, accordingly, she was placed into an arena with various wild beasts, lions, bears, tigers, that sort of thing. And while she's in the arena, after praying, Thecla suddenly notices this trench filled with water and seals. And so she considers this as her last chance to be baptized and elects to hurl herself into the watery trench. And in this bit here, the horrified audience members exclaim, quote, "Do not hurl yourself into the water. So too did the governor weep because the seals were about to devour the beautiful woman." And that's an interesting bit because, the governor is actually the guy who sentenced her to death in the first place. So the fact that he's weeping somehow implies that being devoured by the seals is somehow even more tragic and terrible than being devoured by, lions and tigers and bears. The apparent danger, though, is quickly nullified by divine intervention. That we have here in this bit, quote, "Then she hurled herself into the water in the name of Jesus Christ. But the seals, having witnessed the radiance of the flash of lightning, floated to the surface dead. And there was a cloud of fire around her so that the beast could not attack her, nor could she be seen naked." How convenient. End quote. That last part's not in the quote, but you get the point. So this episode has often seemed an odd one to modern audiences, precisely because it's so out of tune with our modern conceptions of seals as these playful, friendly animals. Why would such innocent creatures be framed as deadly beasts? And so Horst Schneider has also noticed this peculiar episode, and though he provides a good analysis of the episode overall, he comments that it must have puzzled ancient readers as well. And in favor of that, he cites references from Pliny the Elder on seals being trainable and Juvenal on them being slothful creatures, passages that certainly align with our modern views of seals. But I would slightly disagree with Schneider's notion here that the original episode would have seemed strange to contemporaries. It is actually that congruity with the ancient and Byzantine beliefs about seals that give the story life well into the Middle Byzantine period. So as I argue here, we can better understand this story by contextualizing it against this sort of backdrop of other ideas about seals. This, in turn, leads into the main purpose behind the story and why it retained its popularity in Byzantine culture, which was to highlight for these contemporary audiences God's capacity to subvert nature in one very specific, though meaningful way. Now, this isn't actually the only miracle that occurred in that 2nd century text. Immediately prior to this portion of the text, when Thecla is initially thrown into the arena, she is faced with the sight of a bear, a lion, and a lioness. The lioness turns on the other two beasts, killing them, and in the process dying herself. Then immediately following the seal episode itself, other wild beasts are sent into the arena, and they refuse to attack her. After these and other incidences, the governor finally calls her out of the arena to question her further. And the obvious model for all of that is clearly established with the Old Testament story of Daniel and the lion's den, wherein God causes the lion's mouths to shut, similarly saving Daniel's life, a generic subversion of the natural qualities of those animals as a sign of God's favor. But among all these generic incidences, it's the encounter of the seals that still stands out as the most dramatic, given that build-up around the episode. In this regard, seals too stand out not just as generic wild beast, but a specific animal necessary for that episode. Indeed, Schneider has rightly noted that the appearance of seals for the 2nd century text was not just some accidental manuscript error or something like that. It's easily demonstrable by the fact that later texts also have seals mentioned in this episode. So we can see this, for example, in an early Byzantine text, The Life and Miracles of Thecla, dated to about 5th century CE, which is effectively just a reworking of this earlier text in terms of, exactly that, her life and miracles. But rather than exchanging the seals for another animal or removing the episode entirely, this version elaborates on the same tale, now explicitly calling the seals man-eating creatures. Other scattered examples can be seen throughout late antique and Byzantine worlds, attesting that the miracle narrative remained in the popular imagination. And so I'll just give a few representative examples here. Thecla's encounter with the seals specifically is mentioned in the first Greek recension of the Physiologus, alongside Daniel in the lion's den and Jonah's own ordeal. A summary of the incident by Photius likewise still mentions the seals as a prominent element, and again you see references in Nicetas Davis Paphlagonius and Simeon Metaphrastes that likewise seem to foreground the seal incident among Thecla's various miracles. And so it's this centuries-long emphasis on specifically the seal incident in Thecla's story and life that's precisely one of the reasons why I would slightly modify Schneider's statement that the episode would have seemed strange to ancient or Byzantine readers. Because if it stuck out as so peculiar as it does for us modern observers, we would perhaps see the seals be altered in these later iterations. Because it wouldn't be too terribly difficult for later versions of the story to simply substitute that with something like sharks, or alternatively just omit the story entirely, because we have all of those other wild beast encounters that serve perfectly well to illustrate, again, God's favor for Thecla. Because in these sorts of matters of cultural transmission, if something doesn't quite fit, it tends to drop out of popular culture eventually. So what then were the features that actually instead sustained and drove the continuity of Thecla's miraculous encounter with seals? And this is kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning with the effect of imaginary animals. So the first of these is really the seal's interrelation with the Ketos, the most prominent sea monster of the ancient world. And again, there's a lot more that I can say on this sort of thing because it's the subject of a book that I'm writing on it, but I'll keep it succinct here. And so with regard to seals specifically, we see their interrelation with the Ketos as early as the Odyssey, or the text itself, when it's talking about in Book 4, Photius's seals, it actually uses the word phoke, the Greek word for seals, interchangeably with Ketos. So this, and in later Greco-Roman text, seals are essentially construed as one type of Ketos, because Ketos can function as a sort of umbrella category that, yes, it means essentially sea monster, but there's all sorts of other things, whales, sharks, and apparently seals mixed up into that. And this is a feature that also persists up to the Byzantine world. And this part is not something that I'm the first to notice about the Ketos-like nature of seals. this is something that's already been noted by Schneider in his article. He, I think, rightly attributes much of this to the underlying trait of them being perceived not as cute animals as we would, but as akin to the sea monsters of the Greco-Roman world. And Schneider concludes at the very end of his article that the author of this 2nd century text was entirely ignorant of seals, perhaps only knew them from these sort of textual references from Homer. But this is, again, another sort of characterization that I would slightly dispute and want to modify, because among individuals encountering seals even firsthand in the Greco-Roman world, we still have evidence that they're viewed as monstrous or liminal creatures in such regards. So in that way, we can note here, for example, Aristotle's comments on seals as particularly notable, given that he was one of these individuals that did personally observe them. So despite such live encounters, he still habitually characterized seals in purely negative terms, calling them time and time again deformed or unfinished animals as a result of this sort of oddly peculiar liminal nature as creatures that are kind of half in the sea, half in the land. They were, like the Ketus, interpreted as hybrid figures, a feature that Fiona Mitchell also shows to be essentially related to other conceptions of monstrosity in the Greco-Roman imagination. This was accompanied also by the fact that seals had a perceived canine-like nature, a feature that would also serve to explain the origin and interrelation of the two in Homer that could be sustained throughout the intervening centuries. So, for instance, according to Aristotle, seals were saw-toothed animals, a feature that was also attributed to the Ketus as well as dogs in other texts. And elsewhere, Aristotle does specify that all such saw-toothed animals, carnivorous animals, they're flesh eaters, and immediately goes on to also discuss, another creature that he categorizes as saw-toothed wolves, and discusses how they're capable of devouring humans. So you can sort of see through references like that where they're perhaps getting seals, and even Aristotle is categorizing them amongst all these carnivorous animals. So such features added together then were responsible for the more aggressive and fearsome image of the seal, an image further reflected in later incidences like Ovid's comparison of the ferocity of lions and tigers to that of the seal, or Oppian's statement that even bears tremble before the seal. Indeed, William Johnson and David Levine, in their monograph on monk seals in antiquity, have noted these and other persistent attitudes towards essentially demonizing them as deformed creatures in the ancient world. And this was a widespread tendency that explains these textual references to them as essentially savage animals. And this characterization then goes a long way to explain the Thecla episode in its original context. It's moreover Aristotle's Byzantine reception that would be one vector for essentially the continuity of such ideas. So one doesn't have to be entirely ignorant of seals themselves to see their monstrous nature through this sort of Ketus-like and liminal type of thing. And that's another thing that's in the ancient world, monstrosity is a little bit different from how we think of it today, and I can get into that a bit more in the questions if people are curious too. But it's, again, that liminal nature. They perceive that in a bit more eerie of a context than I think a lot of us would as well. We don't think seals are monstrous today because we don't make such a big deal out of that sort of in-between categorization of sea and land type things. But it's also in Christian context that this Ketus-like nature, it will serve to add another additional layer of meanings to seals, which helps move them in an even further negative direction. So that is, again, where the Ketus-like aspect, this imaginary set of associations of animals, is also going to have an even larger effect once we start moving into late antiquity, into the Byzantine period. So to explain how that works, Ketus was also the term that the Septuagint translated for Leviathan, and what's called in Hebrew the Tananim, a sort of vague categorization for another type of serpentine sea monster. Those become translated as Ketus in the Septuagint. And so accordingly, we find throughout Byzantine Christian literature references to the Ketus in biblical context, derived, just to give a couple of examples here, from Job's quote and the Genesis reference to the creation of the Tananim. And notably here, we find, for instance, a passage of Genesis being explained with reference, partially at least, to seals and other marine animals by Michael Glycus, who's, again, using this categorization of Ketus. It means seal, it means whale, it means a bunch of other things, but viewed in a Christian sense, thanks to the Septuagint's translation, it takes on very different connotations as well. So it seems then perhaps a combination of the Aristotelian influence as well as the Septuagint's emphasis on the Ketus were the key forces behind these seals in the original hagiographic text and in the story's Byzantine reception in terms of sustaining it. But there's also one other interesting cultural idea of seals that's at play here to explain another slightly odd thing about this story. In this sort of apotropaic function of seals, some of us were talking beforehand about, seal skins are very prized in the ancient world because they're very water resistant and much more rare. In a sense, they're harder to obtain, but this is also another feature that makes them very highly prized in the ancient world. So such a monstrous nature also imparted upon seals another quality in the ancient imagination. And this is specifically with the fact that seals were held widely to be animals that were considered to be impervious to lightning. So we can note just a handful of representative examples from the ancient world that forms this interpretive basis for the episode with Thecla. So, for instance, a passage from Plutarch purports that ship captains actually cover the tops of their masts with seal skins in order to prevent lightning strikes. And similarly, Pliny the Elder also remarks that some people will actually seek out a tent made of sealskin because it would provide safety during a thunderstorm. And even if we are to believe Suetonius, Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was so terrified of lightning strikes that he kept a sealskin with him at all times. So such usage then is at least conceptually similar to these sorts of apotropaic uses ascribed to dogs themselves in antiquity to ward off various things. In a similar fashion, the liminal and hybrid qualities of the seal have evidently given rise to such fantastical associations and the capacity to ward off a different type of monster. So it was effectively, it seems to have been regarded as something of a law of nature that neither seals nor their skins could be struck by lightning. They just had a sort of natural immunity to that element. So this theme of the subversion of nature is not just that God actively intervenes in the Thecla story to save her life, but specifically in that he does so in a manner that illustrates his ability to subvert a specific aspect or a specific law of nature, to effectively override that at his will in a more dramatic way than the more generic trope from the book of Daniel of just making hostile animals no longer attack. Thecla's story doesn't seem to have eradicated this cultural notion that seals were immune to lightning either. The late antique anonymous Medici, for instance, also still records this idea in a fragment, which closely resembles a section of the Epitome by Theophanes Nonus, writing in the 10th century for Constantine Porphyrianos. So such an environmental idea about seals as having naturally impervious nature to lightning is still at least being reproduced explicitly by at least the Middle Byzantine period. But even aside from these sorts of small explicit incidences, I would argue that it's still an implicit feature that carried well on into the Byzantine reception of Thecla's story as an explanatory feature as to why the story continued into Byzantium. And this is what I mean by considering Thecla seals against the backdrop of these larger notions of the ancient and Byzantine environmental imagination, as it's that interpretive key for understanding the cultural and religious significance of Thecla's encounter with these seals in the Byzantine imagination. This idea of seals as monstrous and possessing a natural resistance to lightning that gives the story significance for proving God's power over them nonetheless. So, this is where we can again return to Schneider's assessment that this episode would have read strange to contemporaries and that the original author was ignorant of what a seal was. I would argue against that slightly, that it wouldn't read strange at all to contemporary audiences. And by contemporary, I mean both those of the 2nd century CE and the later Byzantine world. Similarly, the author of this text perhaps wasn't necessarily ignorant of what a seal was, but knew full well of how they were considered to be in their own day. It's actually only us in the modern world who have such a radically different cultural conception of seals that are forced to do a bit more legwork in order to understand a story like this. So it's perhaps even the case that some, individuals in the Byzantine period did, like Augustus, feel a bit paranoid about lightning strikes and decided to carry, a sealskin around them for that purpose. But Thecla's Ordeal makes the point clear that although, sealskins might have been perceived to have this sort of law, this natural resistance, this apotropaic quality against ordinary lightning, God in the Christian faith actually has the power to override that natural law at will in order to do so, subverting nature itself. For instance, as in the Thecla story, to protect one of his followers, and presumably he could do just as well to strike someone down. So this type of feature lies at the heart of Byzantine conceptions of nature as a world that abided by certain laws for the majority of time, but such laws were, in a sense, always conditional on the will of God, who could subvert them at any time. So our hypothetical individual wearing a sealskin amulet, or just a sealskin in general, could never actually be 100% certain of its ability to protect them, as could perhaps people in earlier non-Christian periods believing that. The active agency of God always left open the possibility for such supernatural occurrences. So I'll leave you then with this absolutely terrifying picture of seals in a pool, and may you never have, the bad luck to fall in a pool with such horrifying creatures. So, yeah, thank you for your time.
Now let's move to the next paper that will give us an ecocritical approach to Seaborne relic importations into Byzantine Constantinople.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I would like to begin to thank the organizers for putting this event together, for allowing me to contribute today. The residents of Constantinople situated themselves in relation to the natural environment around them. They gave particular attention to the sea because of its omnipresence. The mere fact that the Byzantine capital was almost completely surrounded by water left its mark on Byzantine cultural history and identity. More than a mere port city, Constantinople monitored maritime traffic passing through the Bosporus. As Magdaleno has noted, it was a city set in the sea, not merely by it. The Bosporus in particular informed the Byzantines' attitude towards the sea. Deladora has shown that Byzantine conceptualizations of nature were mediated by encounters with specific landscapes that functioned as gateways to understanding the whole environment. In that sense, the Bosporus and the Propontis shaped Byzantine conceptions of the sea. In today's paper, I will immerse into these waters. I will focus on scenes of relics transferred across the straits, exploring how the Byzantines conceived of the sea as a liminal space imbued with quasi-agency. My approach assumes that Byzantine literature viewed the natural environment as repository of signs that could help in understanding the divine order. These scenes reveal how the literate in Constantinople perceived their surrounding marine environment, and vice versa, how this environment shaped their text production. Since late antiquity, relics conferred social and political prestige to the Christians transferring them. Though Constantinople was claimed to be the god-guarded city from the early 7th century, its accumulation of relics remained modest until the 9th century. Emperors inspired relic collection early on, but the city rose to being the primary relic repository in Christendom only during the 9th and 10th centuries. This development occurred on the backdrop of territorial expansion. Beginning in the mid-9th century, military successes on the eastern frontiers facilitated relic acquisition. Imperial involvement in relic collection was revitalized during this period, and the importation of relics from the east to Constantinople served as an ideological underpinning to the imperial claim of supremacy among the Christian peoples, demonstrating the empire's indispensable function in salvation history. Much like other spoils of war, relics from the east were carted off to the Asiatic shore opposite Constantinople and prepared for transport aboard the imperial galley. An entire ceremony formed around this, combining elements of the formal arrival ceremony for an emperor with specific liturgical practices. As in a welcoming ceremony for an emperor returning from the east, now the emperor, patriarch, and courtiers would cross to the Asiatic shore to welcome the relic. The emperor would then take the relic aboard the galley. Upon arrival at the city harbor, the relic was temporarily, typically overnight, deposited in a church where a solemn liturgy took place. The relic remained at that church only until its intended resting place was ready to receive it. Typically on the following day, the relic was paraded through the city and deposited in its final resting place. The earliest description of such a seaborne relic importation into Constantinople comes from John Chrysostom. He celebrates the arrival of St. Phocas's relics from Pontus around the year 400. The event unfolded over 2 days. On the first, the relics arrived by ship and were publicly paraded. On the second, they were taken to be finally deposited in a church. As there's talk about the relics taken on a ship, this church was clearly located Peran, across Constantinople. The main shrine to St. Phocas, firmly attested since the 9th century, stood on the European bank of the Bosporus. Chrysostom urged the entire population to participate in the ceremony, quote, "No girl should stay at home, no married woman hide inside the house," unquote. All should get to the destined church, as even the imperial couple are joining this procession. He called on attendants to, quote, "again turn the sea into a church," unquote, as they had the day before when the relics had arrived from Pontus. They shall go out there with torches and escort the relic-carrying ship, making the fire liquid, and set the water on fire. Going on, he states that no one should be afraid of the sea. Quote, "For a sea billowing with waves is pleasant for a helmsman, just as a church flooding its banks is to a preacher. I say this because in these waters there is neither brine, nor reef, nor sea monsters, but it is an open sea, brimming with a sweet smell. Here the ship does not sail from land to land, but from earth towards heaven, not loaded with goods, but not gold nor silver, but with faith, love, zeal, and wisdom," unquote. As I'm going to show, Chrysostom developed here key motives of a seaborne relic importation into Constantinople and laid the foundation for the full-fledged type scene, whose development is intimately linked to his name. After his death in exile in 407, the remains of Chrysostom were brought from Comana in Pontus to the Holy Apostles in 438. This event, solemnly celebrated on the 27th of January ever since, involved the Bosporus crossing that resonated with the Byzantine imagination, presenting the sea as a means empowered by God, through which God displayed his approval. However, this idea only gradually took shape through various literary stages, before it would impact other seaborne relic importation narratives. In the 5th century, Theodoret briefly noted that the casket containing Chrysostom's remains was transported across the Bosporus, densely packed with boats of faithful attendants holding torches. This detail, of course, echoes Chrysostom's own homily on St. Phocas. Other contemporary accounts are similarly laconic, merely adding that it was the Archbishop Proclus who ferried the casket from Chalcedon to some jetty in the city. In the early 7th century, though, Bishop Theodore of Tremifus slightly expanded the storyline. He explains that the ceremonial part of the importation began at the suburban imperial palace of Heraeon, which is of course anachronistic, as this palace was built a century later. According to this account, the emperor, archbishop, and the people received the casket and transported it on a galley, which passed by Chalcedon, where additional boats joined in the procession before heading to the port of Sophia, from where the relics were taken to St. Thomas. However, the first time the marine environment is told to have responded to the relic's arrival is in the 4th homily of Cosmas Vestitor. This lay dignitary composed it in the late 8th or early 9th century. Cosmas describes the relics contained in a silver casket being taken aboard an ornate galley at Chalkidon. Unlike earlier accounts, Cosmas portrays the sea as visibly reacting to the relic's presence, affirming the importation as divinely sanctioned. Quote, "Suddenly, according to God's plan, there came a hurricane of ferocious blows and a gathering of waves, and one could say that all the boats there were scattered towards the city. Only the galley meant to receive Chrysostom remained alone, for when the tugboat's rope broke, it was skidded to the middle of the strait." So the quote continues, "Behold, the sea was suddenly flattened by a frost of tranquility, and the strait of Chalkidon was carved with countless planks of ships. A roar quickly surged forward, the sound of the waters lapping oars. And again, behold, when they were passing across it, the sea was anointed with the odor of the incenses, and the depths were illuminated by the sparkles of the lights of the torch carriers. And the flashing lustre agitated by the waves turned wet, so to say, the shields and missiles. After the sea had undergone these transformations, the saint boarded the ship. The sea stood still, as is written. But once he put his feet on it, a rapid movement strongly stirred the waters, and the sea parted the waters along the course against the oars, revealing the path of the one long persecuted. It seemed as if the great deep gave a rowing sound in exaltation of the saint's glory, surpassing even the chanting of the hymns. And this soul-carrying fleet, in the shine of candles brighter than the rays of the sun, was drawn along by the current to the church of the apostle and Saint Thomas with the epithet Amantio. They put alongside the shore from where Chrysostom was carried to the church." So Cosmas offers a dramatic account of the transfer of Chrysostom's relic. He begins with a powerful hurricane scattering all ships except the imperial galley. Then the sea is suddenly flattened, evoking Jesus calming the Sea of Galilee. And the other ships converge at Chalkidon to form a procession. Cosmas crafts a whole world of sensory experiences. The sounds of the oars clapping, hymns echoing, the scent of the incense burning, and light reflections on the water. Finally, the galley rapidly moves to Constantinople without the use of oars. Cosmas's homily set a standard and became the primary model for all later homilies on this very importation of Chrysostom. Due to time constraints, I will just mention them. The homily by Emperor Leo VI on the same event, delivered in 883 at Chrysostom's tomb. Also, his son Constantine VII composed a homily based on Cosmas's oration in 958. Two anonymous orators also adapted Leo's homily for the 27th of January celebration. But beyond Chrysostom, I will now demonstrate by one example that Cosmas, through his homily, had also created literary typescene that shaped all subsequent accounts of Seaborne relic importations into Constantinople. In 899, Emperor Leo VI founded a monastery of St. Lazarus for eunuch monks. While the church was still under construction, plans were made to obtain relics. The relics of Lazarus arrived in a silver casket at Chrysopolis and were then brought to Constantinople in October 901, temporarily deposited in Hagia Sophia. Aretas, then court orator and deacon, composed two orations on the events. The first he delivered upon the relic's arrival, and the other for the consecration of the church in May 902 in the emperor's presence. The second oration recounts the events of the previous year. Aretas describes how the emperor boarded a galley at dawn from the great palace and crossed to Chrysopolis to receive the relics. The emperor was welcomed by a large crowd lining the shore. According to Aretas, the sea was not completely calm. Its waves were not breaking into foam, but the sea swelled gently and carried the imperial flotilla with joyful leaps. Aretas embellishes the scene with rich symbolic detail. One could witness the spectacle of fish leaping from the water, gathering in groups by species, and all bursting into song as if breaking the natural bond. Another marvel followed, supported by the emperor's munificence, thanks to the reflection of, quote, countless fires of wax. The maritime procession appeared as if it was ablaze with liquid fire, unquote, evoking the infamous Greek fire. But the singing fish stand out as the oration's most striking imagery. AI gave me a hand in making this idyllic scene easier to picture for you. Arita stresses that this occurrence was entirely out of the ordinary and against the natural order. To him, the sea was governed by natural principles that were momentarily disrupted by the presence of the relic. The fish gathered and venerated relic together with the divinely ordained emperor, mirroring the expected reverence of the residents of Constantinople. It is evident that Arita's drew on Cosmas's homily as a model. The key motives are recounted in the same way in sequence. Yet Aritas innovates in one aspect. He animates not only the sea, but also the maritime fauna. This motif draws on ancient models and ideas, particularly the Acts of Philip, where aquatic animals respond to divine light appearing during the night. The text describes their reaction, quote, "The sea monsters and the fish and the beasts beheld this brilliance in the sea. They formed a circle, did obeisance to the light, and cried out hymns in their own language." Unquote. Though rooted in biblical antecedents, Aritas reworks this into a distinctly Byzantine vision of relic veneration, emphasizing that sea animals are sensitive to the divine presence. I cannot present any more texts. Suffice to say that in total a dozen Byzantine texts from the 9th to the 10th centuries include such a type scene. To conclude, through his oration, Cosmas Vestito created a powerful model, a type scene. It emerged in the early 9th century and peaked in the 10th, coinciding with a period of intensified relic transfers from the east to Constantinople. Its frequent inclusion in text suggests that it held special significance for the city's residents. More than a mere relic transport, its ceremonial was replete with ideological messages reflecting ideas about the relationship between the city's populace and the emperor on one side and the divine on the other. That said, the relic transfer across the Bosporus was not just a ceremonial event, but as a type scene, it was a recognizable piece of storytelling, which was composed according to a distinctive structure and built around a set of motifs. I propose to break down the scene into 5 literary motifs, and I will now briefly note their function and symbolism. At the beginning of the type scene, the sea is often described as turbulent, with strong winds attributed to the season, or sometimes without clear course. Once the relic is placed aboard a ship, the waters of the Bosporus are suddenly flattened and with waves gently lapping the shore. The procession then sets out, described as a grand spectacle. Incense and torchlight are commonly mentioned, the latter casting flickering reflections and sparks across the sea. Although the texts rarely specify the time of day, these sensory details suggest the crossing occurred at dusk and continued through nightfall to heighten the visual effect. In some accounts, not only are the waves flattened, but even sea animals join the celebration. Finally, the transporting galley is sometimes described as speeding towards its destination without the use of oars, another miracle underscoring the saint's desire to be deposited in the city. Previous scholarship has viewed these accounts primarily as asserting the emperor's legitimacy as God-appointed ruler vis-à-vis the capital's populace. Indeed, the ceremony is largely shaped from the prescriptions deployed to welcome emperors after longer absences. While the notion of the emperor as a god-chosen ruler is certainly present in these accounts, I contend that this interpretation should be nuanced to give fuller consideration of its liturgical dimension. Specifically, I argue for a shift in focus to the relic itself, which provokes responses from the marine environment. The various miracles recounted in the type scene pertain to the transgression of the laws of nature. They serve a critical function, proving the relic's authenticity. The type scene's primary function, I contend, is to remove any doubt surrounding the genuineness of the translated relic. The emergence of the type scene reflects a concern about the authenticity of relics, suggesting that relics arriving from the distant east could be contested. The other scenes frame reconciliation between once exiled, but now triumphant churchmen, and the emperors in Constantinople. While a relic's ability to heal remains essential, its power to provoke a response from the natural environment, especially through a momentous transgression of the laws of nature, seems to have emerged as an even more persuasive testament to its sanctity. Following Basil of Caesarea, nature operates within nomological frameworks, the so-called laws of nature. But as nature is part of God's creation, it remains under providential supervision. Therefore, miracles were not seen as violations of nature, but as divine interventions within creation. In the type scene, diseased transgressive behavior is thus depicted as instigated by God, triggered by the relic's presence. We should understand the cultural logic of the Byzantines on its own terms. What a modern reader might label supernatural, such as the sea or its animals reacting to a relic, was for the Byzantines entirely natural and within the realm of lived experience. Through an ecocritical lens, the type scene showcases that the natural environment was never conceived as separate from the divine. We thus should not exclude the divine from the analysis. Instead, the inextricability of the natural world and God in Byzantine thought compels us to include the divine in our ecocritical reasoning of Byzantine texts. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions later on the Q&A.
And now we move on to the last presentation by Ayşenur Mulla-Topcan, Locusts in early Patristics and Byzantine Hagiography.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you, the organizers, and having me here, and also thank you to all of you that's still staying here till the very end of the day. Today, I'm going to talk about Locusts in Byzantine Hagiography. I'm working on a PhD project called Byzantine Cultural Entomology. Locust is also one of my insects of my project. So insects are often overlooked in the narrative of many cultures. However, they have a particular place within Christian theology. Despite their seemingly minor role, these tiny creatures are woven throughout the biblical text as potent symbols carrying spiritual meanings. Among them, the locust stands out for its destructive power, symbol for asceticism, and a model of its organizational skills. This paper explores the portrayal of locusts in Byzantine religious writing, focusing on biblical intertextuality, symbolic meanings, and the theological reflections. Before delving into the roles of locusts, it is worth briefly addressing the terminology. In ancient Greek, several terms are used for locusts, including akris, brachos, and atelebos. These terms sometimes distinguish between its phases, such as gregarious and the solitary, and ancient sources occasionally used atelebos and akris interchangeably. However, in Byzantine sources, the most frequently encountered term is akris, which also appears prominently in the biblical Greek text, including Septuagint and the New Testament. In this presentation, every reference to locust corresponds to the Greek term akris. Perhaps the most vivid biblical encounters with locusts are in Exodus and Revelation. In Exodus 10, God sends a plague of locusts upon Egypt, and after the Pharaoh refuses to let the Israelites go, the locusts cover the land, devour all remaining crops, and bring devastations, showing God's power and judgment. In Revelation 9, where a fallen star opens the abyss, releasing smoke and locust-like creatures compared to scorpions, indicates that the scorpion's power was given to the locusts. The comparison to scorpions, emphasizing their capacity to inflict suffering, is also implied in Luke 10, where Jesus tells his disciples they have authority over evil, symbolized by serpents and scorpions, and promises divine protection. Christian conceptions of nature are heavily influenced by Genesis 1, and I quote, "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" This anthropocentric hierarchy has often led to the perception of animals as a subordinate to human needs. However, Gianna Kay challenges the view by arguing that nature in Christian theology functions as an instrument of divine justice. She convincingly interprets ecological disaster in the Old Testament, such as the locust plagues, as consequences of human sin rather than natural occurrences. In this sense, Christianity is neither ecocentric nor anthropocentric, but rather theocentric. These theological frameworks help us to understand how ecological events such as locust invasion appears in Byzantine sources. Various Byzantine sources, especially John Skiliskas, mention locust invasions as part of recurring natural disaster. He records outbreaks in the mid-10th century and the 2 times in the mid-11th century. The first one occurred in the 11th century. He narrates as follows. For some time, the eastern themes had been consumed by locusts, compelling the inhabitants to sell their children and move to the track. The emperor gave to every one of them 3 pieces of gold and arranged for them to return home. The locusts were finally carried away by a powerful wind, fell into the high sea of the Hellespont, and perished. They were washed up onto the shore, where they covered the sand of the beach. And Skilistas mentions another locust invasion with an emphasis on its symbolic meaning. The swarms of locusts which had expired on the sands of the shore of the Hellespont now spontaneously regenerated and overran the coastal region of the Hellespont again, devastating the Thracian theme for 3 whole years. Then they appeared in Pergamon but perished there, as one of the bishop's servants saw beforehand in a vision. He adds, "These came and will come upon you because of your transgressions of God's commandment and desecration of the Emperor Romanos, which has taken place, and the violation of his marriage bed." In Byzantine hagiography, then, locust attacks feature as bad omened political events, foreshadowing imminent disaster in a polity. In the daily life of Byzantines, however, locusts played a different role. Their appearances could impoverish whole regions and suddenly and unexpectedly lead to the food shortages. In the countryside, locust attacks were a frequent challenge, as shown by the Geoponica. This 10th century agricultural handbook gives advice how to protect crops against the locust attacks. However, Johannes Koder summarizes that there was no remedy for the locust infestation. With no practical fix available, peasants turned to holy men to intervene and save the crop. I will now discuss such locusts as they appear in Byzantine hagiography. A vivid example is given in the life of Theokletos of Lacedaemon, who lived in the late 9th century, and the life begins with a description of a harvest preparation, joy, and excitement of the farmers who are about having a good harvest since the fields are very fruitful. It was described as farmer sharpening his sickle was happily dreaming of a rich harvest and great prosperity, believing his success was certain. However, he was unaware of the proverb, "There is a many a slip between the cup and the lip." Shortly thereafter, a cloud of locusts, immeasurably in number, greater than our eyes can see, fell upon the harvest. They were soon to transform those beautiful, rich, and fruitful fields into a wretched spectacle. They suddenly became ugly, stripped of their comeliness not by the hand of the farmers, but cut down by the wild mounds of the locust. That good harvest was not to be transferred to the threshing floor, but was gone to the ruin. After this incident, the text describes how a holy man came to intervene in the situation and save the crops. And as soon as he heard of the attack of that frightful horde, his compassion became ardent and immediate, and without a delay he offered no other help but his own staff as a weapon against them and stopped the plague of locusts. As soon as he planted his staff into the soil in front of the wheat that was being destroyed, this destructive and harmful arm disappeared. It had been sent as a plague upon us who sin without realizing it. Although there is no direct mention of sin, the farmer was punished and a swarm of locusts destroyed his crop. The proverb insinuates that he had been greedy or ungrateful. He did not praise God, but focused on collecting and storing all the fruits for himself. Whatever the sin may have been, its punishment was delivered through locust. In this scene, the saint appears as mediator, reminding the farmer of God's presence and the virtues, blessing the soil and the crops by touching them with his staff, forcing that the locust to leave and to return everything to its former sinless state. In doing so, He reminds the peasant of his duties. As Crissa Borbo indicates, paths, especially locusts, have formed a stable repertoire where the crisis was in many cases eventually managed by the intervention of a holy man. Another scene is offered in the life of Saint Athanasius of Athos, a Byzantine monk and the founder of the Magisterium Mount Athos. This text was written in the mid-11th century. The incident occurred in a small island close to the Lemnos called Neoi. There were herd animals and sufficient crops for both people and animals. One day, the locusts invaded the island and destroyed everything except the vineyards. The monks had to relocate their animals. After this incident, they sought help from Athanasius. Upon arriving at the island, this miraculous father found that locusts had devoured everything, but they left only the vineyards. The saint intervened in the situation, and the brethren in the monastery prayed together for the recovery from the damage caused by the locusts. The monks were puzzled as to why the locusts left the vineyards untouched, some suggesting that locusts do not naturally consume wine. However, the father assured them that if they were to cut all the leaves and throw them away, the locusts would eat it. Through the prayers, he saved the island. A great number of birds, specifically a species called Seleucis, devoured the locusts very quickly. Here, Seleucis refers to a very specific bird species. The motif of sanctified water and divine protection reappears in the life of Saint Simeon, as included in the life of David, Simeon, and George, where his physical presence and the water from his hands become tools against the plague. These three brothers lived as monks in the island of Lesbos. Saint Simeon fled to Constantinople to escape an Arab invasion. Stephanos, described as a pious man, hosted Saint Simeon and asked him to bless the house wine jar, which led to the first miracle. The wine jar in the house never ran out, and everyone drank from it. This visit was crucial because Stephanos secretly collected the water that dripped from Simeon's hand. After washing them, he then stored this water in a vessel and later sprinkled it on the fields. When many locusts were descending upon the outlying parts of Constantinople, as they did once in Egypt, and were completely destroying the whole crop, the aforementioned very God-loving Stephan went to visit the holy man, and he secretly took the water that dripped from Simeon's hands. When he washed up at mealtime, put it in a pitcher and sprinkled it on fields. By the grace of God and through the intercession of the holy man, the water put the locusts to flight as from a whip, and it kept the crop unharmed so that they supplied produce many times greater in prior years. There are numerous other accounts of saints saving people, harvest, and animals from the locust infestation. However, beyond their destructive role, locusts also held a different kind of significance as source of food. John the Baptist is perhaps the most well-known example, remembered for his austere lifestyle, wearing a rough garment and surviving on a diet, including locusts. Consuming locusts in this context was not merely a matter of subsistence, but a sign of detachment from the worldly pleasures. His diet is discussed by Gregory of Nazianzus, one of the Cappadocian Church fathers. In his work Carmina Morelia, he reflects on the temporariness of life by stating, everyone ends up in a tombstone, returning to dust. The space is equal for slaves and the kings. Isn't that enough? Therefore, do not delight too much in present goods, nor grieve excessively for the hardship of this life. Saint Gregory describes John the Baptist's way of living as reminding Matthew 3 and say, the locust and wild honey were John's sustenance. His attire was camel hair, his voice loud, his home was the white heavens and the desert below. Locusts as diet are also a topic in the Synopsis Scripturae Sacrae by Athanasius of Alexandria. In this text, he addressed Leviticus regulations on clean and unclean animals for consumption. He notes all creeping, flying creatures are unclean, except those that move on four legs but have additional limbs above their feet for jumping from the ground, such as the locust, patric, and similar animals, and the quail. It is notable that the locust is the only insect mentioned while the others are birds. Beyond questions of diet and purity, locusts also appear in theological texts as models of disciplined, purposeful living. James Kelhofer highlights that the only favorable mention of locusts in an Old Testament context, particularly when they are in their gregarious phase, is found in Proverb 30, which praises their ability to coordinate without an apparent leader. This positive connotation of locus is also reflected in Byzantine religious texts, with John of Damascus' Sacra Parallella. As a prime example, John begins by asserting that those who seek God will find peace, and he then offers guidance by stating, "Keep mercy and justice, and draw near to your God always. Listen to me, eat what is good, and your soul shall delight in abundance. All who separate themselves from the Lord will be ashamed." He warns that turning away from God's path can lead to sin. Following these admonitions, he lists animals that believers should emulate in their lives. He mentions locusts, noting their wisdom. A king does not rule the locust, yet it marches out as one with one command. This suggests that locusts understand their purpose and act collectively despite their lack of a visible leader. Though small and seemingly insignificant, locusts organize around a unified objective. John of Damascus might be encouraging believers to do the same, to act as one and fulfill their purpose on earth by obeying God's commandments. In Byzantine religious writing, always based on biblical reference, locusts appear as agents symbolizing sin and accompanying more severe disasters. Beyond their association with devastation, locusts occasionally symbolize collective discipline and unity, acting together without a visible leader. Their appearance in John the Baptist's ascetic diet further illuminates their familiarity in their daily life beyond just negative connotations. Locusts are feared when they are a swarm, but when encountered as a singular figure, a locust could be considered a harmless and consumable creature. From the perspective of lived realities, the many mentions of locusts in Byzantine hagiography reflect the severity and frequency of their attacks in daily life. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, time for questions.
Thank you all very, very much for your great and excellent papers. It was really very, very good, and I've learned a lot. I have just a little comment or addendum for Ryan, because about the seal of Foki, there's also some passages, some paragraphs in Seranea, which is very interesting, and you might want to read, because there is, as when I remember correctly, the seal also said that it has a face similar to the human face, so it's very important for medicine. And the other thing is that you should wear shoes made by seal skin, which are against arthrosis and all these podagra disorders, because, and this is the analogy with the lightning and with the fire, because this is thought to be a fire in the body, this podagra. So this is a very, very strong analogy. And I think also the picture with the human face of the seal is very touching. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those references. I wasn't aware of those, so I'll definitely look into those.
I think it's in the second series,
Okay.
but you should look it up.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I was wondering about, I assume you're familiar with the belief in Selkies. And I was wondering if there was any trace of that in the Greco-Roman sources, or is that perhaps the reason that we have a different sort of understanding of seals to Greco-Roman people, because we have this alternative tradition that makes them more human and therefore more like us. And if they didn't have that, is that why?
Yeah, and so like in terms of Selkies, like in terms of them like transforming into other things, that sort of thing, or
Well, the fact that they're humans, and if you take away the skin, then they should be a human. So they're still a liminal monster, but they are a human liminal monster.
yeah, I mean that Cyronides reference with the human face, that definitely is in the right area. So that's definitely one reference I'll have to look into a bit more. But other than that one, not so much in terms of human that I've come across. They don't really transform into humans in any Greco-Roman myth that I'm aware of. So it's a bit distinct there. They don't have transformative powers in terms of shape shifting or anything like that. But yes, that is something I'd definitely want to look into if there's any larger connections, larger things, because seals are popular in lots of different world folklore and mythology. So I'm always interested in comparative sort of things like that.
I just wanted to build on what Isabel told a minute ago. It's all about the sympathetic link that binds the sensible cosmos, all parts of the sensible cosmos. And I think this pretty much explains everything about the seal's face and the human face and things like this. And concerning Ayşenur's paper, I would be reluctant, if I'm not mistaken, and if I heard you well, to characterize the Christian theology as theocentric. By and large, you are more or less right, but it all depends on which part of theology you're referring to. Because a major part of theology, like the New Testament message, is soteriological. So it's about the salvation of the human race. So I would suggest to discuss this with a theologian.
Thank you very much. This question goes to Ayşenur. It's not a small question. I'm not a specialist in locusts. I realize that they are always in singular. All the time it's iagris. Okay, but we are speaking about a big swarm. Does that have a particular meaning? Does that mean that they are seen as a collective, not as a single being?
Yes, when they are referring to swarm, they mostly use smenos, acris, not the plural version of it. And I think they perceive locust as a swarm, because the acris is a swarm of the locust, the one they comes and destroy everything. But atelebos is the small one, the solitary face, and it is the only, they use atelebos for the one, only singular one, as far as I encountered.
I got a question for you, Ryan, just about Aristotle. And were you saying Aristotle calls seals monsters? And I was just wondering, because I'm just wondering, how you take Aristotle as a figure for evidence of a kind of more kind of monster view, because he's engaging in a biological program. He's trying to explain these things. There's lots of literature on them. We could talk about, like Charlotte Witt's paper on deformed kinds and stuff. But I'm just wondering, what you think the importance of Aristotle is as a source for understanding what seals are. I guess that's more kind of what I'm asking.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, yes, this is a good question. I kind of alluded to this in the talk a little bit. This is one of those sections where, like, in the written version of this would have a long footnote, because this is writing off the back of a scholar by the name of Fiona Mitchell, who I think it was in 2021, did this book on monstrosity in Greek literature, and basically the different types. So you can have monstrosity in terms of what, Herodotus or Ctesias does, these, dog-headed men out in India. That's a bit more close to what we're talking about with, monsters, these hybrid type figures. But she also shows that there's a lot of similarities with the way that Aristotle speaks about certain animals. So it's a bit of a different type of monstrosity, but her study really shows that, and she calls it, I believe, something like biological monstrosity, that the way Aristotle speaks of certain creatures, he doesn't use the word monster in the same way that, you know, Patristics or Herodotus or someone like that does explicitly, but he seeks out a lot of this sort of similar characteristics, the hybridity, the liminal qualities type stuff. So that's where I see that in terms of deformed animals, that it's again, it's sort of like an implied type of monstrosity, and something that's different in that if you really want to compare the language across classical Greek texts, there is some similarities in language there. Does that help explain it a bit?
Well, I just. I mean, because you're not doing technical Aristotelian work, but I'm just what, because he does call some things monsters and peperomenos, right? Which is what he's calling them. He's calling them deformed, and it's kind of a congenital. He really thinks that that seals have back fins that haven't developed properly for a quadruped, and they do that congenitally. They do that all the time, which is weird for his teleological system. But he does have, and they're dualizers, which means they're aquatic terrestrial or terrestrial aquatics. So in a sense, they are liminal in this very restricted way. They're not liminal as mammals or something like this, like and marsupials, like this kind of thing. But they have their own kind of liminality. What do you make of that? I guess is what I'm curious, because Aristotle is doing something very specific. And the fact that he calls some dualizers monsters, but not all of them, and seals he doesn't call monsters when he could. I mean, he calls females monsters, as it were, and so but he doesn't say this about seals. So it's just again a question of what we mean when we're talking about monstrosity in Aristotle and that how far to take it. But I mean, I haven't read the book, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question too. I mean, and it's partially also, I think, a question too of how the later sources too receive Aristotle and things like that as well. I mean, I'd have to go back to, Mitchell's study, but she has the 5th chapter of that book is all about Aristotle's monstrosity, and yet, the things like considering women monsters as well is in there too. So yeah, to answer the question, I'd have to go back and look at that for sure and see all of the references and stuff like that to get a sure thing. Thank you, though.
The first thing is a suggestion. And I don't know if it's relevant if we are talking about how Byzantines and ancient Greeks perceived the seals. Perhaps it's relevant the fact that seals apparently were not eaten. We don't find their bones anywhere archaeologically. So that places them in a separate category. Unlike the other marine creatures which fall under the category of chytos, sharks, large tunas, they were all edible, but not the seals. The other small comment is that not everybody today sees seals as cute, pretty things. If you're a fisherman, seals are a competitor at best and an enemy very often. Is there could you see a gender dimension in that story about Thecla? Thecla is a woman. A lioness didn't eat her. And then the seal comes, and the seal has a female.
Yeah.
Is a female word in Greek. Could it be something?
Yeah, it could be. I know some people have definitely commented on the lioness story, exactly that it is specifically the lioness that turns in. And so, yes, it could as well be, for that. Although, the seals are not on Thecla's side there. They have to be struck down. So, but yes, definitely in the lioness story.
Yes, I want to say, I think too that Aristotle needs very careful reading at that point. How negative was his expression that is translated by the English deformed? I'm not quite sure. It's hard. From all point of view, you could indeed say that seals are deformed quadrupeds. They are quadrupeds. But my real question, was for was on the question for Ayşenur, and that is, how did the saint eat his locusts?
Sorry.
How did the saint eat his locusts? Did he eat them raw? Were they held
Richie.
down with wild honey, which would have made them rather pleasanter, perhaps? Is it any suggestions in any sources for how locusts are eaten?
Yes, as far as I read James Hofer articles and books, it was suggested to boil it in sometimes, but they are not eating this the gregarious phase of locusts, but they eat the smaller, the lonely ones. So
One by one.
yeah, by one. Exactly, and they suggested to boil them or just like grill a little bit.
I have a small question to Max Ritter. The Church of Saint, the monastery of Saint Phocas and the Dioscorus, there's, as far as I know, no source before the 9th century. And if I'm not mistaken, it is expressly stated that this was a new foundation.
Yes, that's true, I think. But I would like say, it's still not impossible that this church already existed or was built around 400, and that the 9th century was a rebuilding phase after, you know yourself very well that Sukai was very much affected by the 7th century attacks. So I still find it quite probable to identify this church there. Of course, it's built on a rather weak foundation because it's basically based just on this one term, peran, and the fact that it's transported by ship, right? So it doesn't really tell us how long the journey was, but it must be in the area of Constantinople outside the city. Yes. But yeah, of course you're right. We cannot be precisely sure that it is exactly this church, but I think it doesn't diminish the argument whatsoever.